Tonight we're stepping into the sands of ancient Egypt, but not into the lives of pharaohs or priests. Instead, we're walking alongside the people history often whispers about the slaves. How did they spend their days? What work filled their mornings? What struggles weighed on their shoulders? And what fleeting moments of rest or humanity gave them strength? We're going to explore the rhythm of their lives from the blazing sun of the fields to the dim lantern glow of the workshops and temples. But before you get too comfortable, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop your city name and local time in the comments so we'll know exactly where in the world you're watching us from. When most people imagine life in ancient Egypt, they think of towering pyramids, golden treasures, and mighty pharaohs. But hidden beneath the glamour of kings and gods were the thousands of people who carried the weight of that civilization on their backs. The Egyptian slaves. These men, women, and children formed the backbone of Egyptian society. They were the unseen hands that built the temples, the fields, and even the daily routines of the wealthy. Without them, the mighty Nile kingdom would have looked very different. But before we imagine what their daily lives were like, we need to clear up a common misconception. Slavery in Egypt did not always look the same as it did in later times, such as in Rome or during the transatlantic slave trade. Egyptian slavery was often tied to war debt or punishment for crime. Conquered foreigners were brought in as forced labor. Prisoners of war were handed over to temples or the crown. And then there were Egyptians themselves who could fall into slavery because of unpaid debts. Sometimes entire families were bound together because one person owed more grain than they could pay. So when we picture Egyptian slaves, we are not just seeing faceless strangers from distant lands, but also Egyptians who lost their freedom. The day for a slave in Egypt began early with the rising of the sun, just as the farmers and priests stirred to life in the villages. The Nile was everything to Egypt. It dictated the rhythm of planting and harvesting, and so it dictated the rhythm of slavery. As well, a slave working in the fields would wake up before dawn. The air would still be cool, the desert heat not yet pressing down. They would grab a simple meal if food was given: bread made from emmer wheat, maybe some onions or beans. Sometimes just water was all they had, and it was straight into the labor. If you were a slave in agriculture, your life meant long hours bent over fields. You would plant grain, flax, or vegetables. You might be ordered to tend cattle or herd goats. The Nile provided fertile soil, but it also demanded constant work. Irrigation canals had to be dug, repaired, and maintained. A slave might spend his whole day knee-deep in mud, making sure water flowed properly to the crops. Overseers watched carefully, making sure no one slowed down or slacked off. These overseers could be cruel, often armed with sticks or whips to drive the workers forward. For the slaves, there was no question of rest. You worked until the sun began to set, and only then were you allowed to return to your quarters. Not all slaves were out in the blazing sun, though. Others were kept inside grand households, where their lives were a different kind of exhausting. A household slave might work in the kitchen, grinding grain into flour over heavy stone querns for hours on end. Others served as cleaners, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, carrying water jars from the Nile back to the house. The wealthier the household, the more specialized the slaves. Some became attendants to the lady of the house, helping her with perfumes, jewelry, or linen dresses. Others acted as tutors or caretakers for children. Still others guarded the door or fetched goods from the market. Household slaves might sleep inside the house, but they were never equals. They ate the leftovers of the master's food. They lived under constant watch, and their fates depended entirely on the moods of those they served. Temple slaves lived in yet another world. Temples in Egypt were not just places of worship, they were also centers of wealth and administration. Temples owned fields, granaries, bakeries, and workshops, and slaves were used to keep all these systems running. A temple slave might spend his day brewing beer for offerings, or weaving linen for priests' robes, or carving statues for ceremonies. Even though this work was connected to the gods, it did not make it easier. A mistake in a temple workshop could lead to harsh punishments because it was seen as disrespect to the divine. Then there were the builders. Perhaps the most famous image of Egyptian slavery is tied to pyramids and monuments. While historians debate whether the pyramid builders were slaves or paid workers, we know for certain that massive projects relied on forced labor, especially from war captives. These slaves were marched into work gangs, carrying limestone blocks, hauling ropes, and dragging sledges across sand. Hours stretched into days and days into years. There was little dignity in this work. The overseers kept order with whips and shouting, and the monuments rose stone by stone on the backs of human suffering daily. Life for a slave was defined by repetition and exhaustion, but it was also filled with uncertainty. A free person in Egypt at least knew what tomorrow would look like, but a slave never had such assurance. You might be sent from the fields to the household or sold to a temple at any time. Families could be broken apart, overnight husbands separated from wives' children, torn away from parents. Slaves had no voice in these decisions. They were property, and property could be moved, traded, or disposed of without hesitation. And yet, despite these harsh realities, there were small pockets of humanity. Slaves did form bonds with each other. They shared food when they could. They whispered stories at night to remind themselves they were still people, not just tools. They found moments of laughter even while grinding grain or hauling water, and sometimes they resisted. In quiet ways, slaves might work slowly to make a task stretch longer. They might feign sickness to escape a day in the fields. They might sneak an extra bite of food. These little acts of rebellion were dangerous, but they were also the only way. A slave could reclaim a shred of controls. A day in the life of an Egyptian slave was more than just endless labor. It was a balancing act between survival and endurance. The fields, the temples, the houses, the quarries, they all demanded human effort. And behind the shining image of Egypt, with its gods and pharaohs, was the weary reality of those who carried the load on their backs. If we want to understand how Egyptian slaves truly spent their days, we can not only look at the labor they performed, we also have to step into the quieter moments of their existence. The times when the overseers were gone, when the tools were set down, and when the desert sky turned red with the setting sun. Because for all the pain and exhaustion of their days, slaves still lived lives. They ate, they rested, they tried to connect with each other, and they tried in their own small ways to hold onto fragments of humanity. Food was at the center of survival for a slave in Egypt. But what food looked like depended entirely on where they worked and how generous or cruel their masters were. In the fields, a slave might be given simple rations. Bread made from barley or emmer wheat was the most common. Sometimes the bread was coarse, filled with bits of husk and sand from poorly ground flour, making it rough on the teeth. Along with bread, there might be onions, leeks, or beans. A lucky day meant a few dried fish or a scrap of meat, but such meals were rare. Most slaves learned to fill their stomachs with bread and water and endure the constant hunger. Slaves who worked in wealthy households might receive slightly better meals because they ate what was left behind from their masters' tables. After banquets or large family dinners, scraps of roasted goose, duck, or lamb might be handed down to the servants. Slaves could taste honey wine and fruits, but only in the form of leftovers. Nothing was truly theirs. Even food was a reminder that they survived only on the mercy of others. For children growing up as slaves, this meant a lifetime of thin meals and stunted growth. Many would never reach the strength or health of free Egyptians after long hours of work. The sleeping quarters of slaves offered little comfort. Field slaves often slept in simple huts made of mud brick or even in rough shelters built from reeds. Families might share one small room if they were lucky. More often men, women, and children were separated and packed into crowded spaces with mats on the ground for bedding. Household slaves sometimes slept inside storerooms, kitchens, or even the doorways of their masters' houses, always close enough to be called upon. At any hour, the nights were hot and filled with the buzzing of insects, and the air smelled of sweat and smoke. Privacy was almost impossible, and rest was often broken by the sound of others, coughing, crying, or muttering in their sleep. Despite this exhaustion, slaves did manage to carve out small pieces of community and connection. When work was finished, they might talk softly about their families or share stories from their past. Some sang songs, simple chants that helped them remember who they were before slavery. Songs also helped pass the time during long hours of grinding grain or carrying water. Their voices were not heard in temples or palaces, but they echoed in the workers' huts and fields, carrying fragments of identity. Generations' religion was another lifeline. Even though slaves were at the bottom of Egyptian society, they were still tied to the same beliefs that guided everyone else. They prayed to the gods of the Nile, and the household spirits they left small offerings when they could: a piece of bread, a flower, a handful of water. For many slaves, the idea of the afterlife offered hope that life would not always be this way. Egyptian religion promised that if you lived a good life, your heart would be weighed against the feather of truth in the hall of judgment. If it was lighter than the feather, you would pass into eternal peace. To a slave who endured endless suffering each day, the thought of eternal rest in the field of reeds was a comfort. Beyond measure, children born into slavery faced a different kind of struggle. They never knew freedom, but they quickly learned their place in the world. Little boys might be sent to carry water jars or tend animals. Little girls might grind grain or fetch firewood. Childhood was short and filled with labor. Yet even in this harsh reality, children still found moments to play. They carved little dolls from wood or shaped animals from mud. They laughed when they could, chasing each other along the riverbanks while their parents worked. Their innocence was often brief, but their laughter carried a fragile reminder that even slavery could not fully erase the human spirit. Relationships between masters and slaves were complicated. On one hand, slaves were property and could be beaten, sold, or discarded at will. On the other hand, some slaves lived in close daily contact with their masters, which sometimes created fragile bonds. A master might rely on a slave for loyalty and trust, especially in the household. A nurse who cared for a master's children might be treated with a kind of familiarity, even while still being owned. Rarely some slaves could be rewarded with freedom if they proved especially loyal or useful. Though this was far from common, it was enough to create a sense of possibility. However faint, yet cruelty was never far away. Punishments for disobedience or mistakes could be brutal. Beatings were common. Overseers might strike slaves with sticks or whips for working too slowly or for answering back. Branding or marking slaves with ink was another form of control designed to remind everyone of their status. Even small acts of defiance could lead to terrible consequences, so most slaves learned to stay silent. And obedient survival meant keeping your head down and doing the work demanded of you. Still, in the cracks of this harsh world, slaves found ways to resist, even if only quietly. A slave in the fields might hide a small piece of grain for their children. A household slave might sneak an extra sip of beer when no one was watching. Some tried to run away, though. Egypt's deserts and strict laws made escape nearly impossible. These small acts of defiance might seem tiny, but to the people living them, they were powerful. They were proof that even in bondage, they still had a will of their own. So, when we imagine the daily lives of Egyptian slaves, we must see more than just the whips and the endless fields. Yes, they suffered. Yes, they were controlled and mistreated, but they also dreamed, laughed, prayed, and whispered stories to one another. Their humanity was not erased by their slavery. It endured in the smallest details of food, shared songs, or a child's muddy laughter by the Nile. It is in those details that we find the true heartbeat of lives lived in shadows. When we step deeper into the world of Egyptian slaves, we realize that their lives were not just about work, food, and sleep. Their existence was tied to the entire structure of Egyptian society. To truly see their days, we need to explore how they fit into the grand machine of the Nile Kingdom. Slaves were everywhere, yet almost invisible, woven into the rhythm of farms, temples, palaces, and villages. They were both vital and forgotten. The economic system of Egypt rested heavily on agriculture. Grain was not just food, it was wealth. It paid taxes, supported armies, and fueled the building of temples and monuments. Without grain, Egypt would collapse, and slaves were a crucial part of making sure those fields kept producing every year. When the Nile flooded, it brought fertile soil, but the moment the waters receded, the backbreaking labor began. Slaves worked to plow, sow, and harvest crops. They repaired dikes and dug irrigation canals. They hauled heavy baskets of mud to strengthen embankments. This endless cycle of tasks made them essential gears in the Egyptian economy, and yet their reward was only survival. Slaves were also deeply connected to Egypt's military campaigns. Pharaohs often boasted of their victories, not just in terms of land and treasure, but also in the numbers of captives brought back. These prisoners of war filled the ranks of slaves in temples and estates. A Nubian warrior captured in battle might end up grinding grain for a temple. A Canaanite soldier might spend his life quarrying stone for a monument. Egypt's expansion meant an ever-growing supply of forced labor. Each conquest added more lives to the cycle of servitude, and each slave became a silent symbol of the pharaoh's power inside the temples. The role of slaves went beyond mere labor. Temples were centers of wealth, storing grain, gold, livestock, and land. They needed a constant workforce to keep everything running. Slaves baked bread, brewed beer, wove linen, and maintained sacred animals. Priests relied on this hidden workforce to ensure that rituals never faltered. A festival honoring a god might look grand and divine on the surface, with music, incense, and offerings. But behind the scenes, dozens of slaves worked tirelessly to prepare the food, clean the spaces, and move the supplies. Without them, the gods themselves would have gone hungry in their great stone halls. In the world of construction, the story was even more dramatic. The monuments that still stand today, from pyramids to temples to colossal statues, were not just marvels of engineering. They were monuments of human endurance and suffering. Entire workforces were organized into gangs, each with overseers, drivers, and taskmasters. Slaves dragged sledges loaded with stone through the desert sun. They carried water to soften the sand beneath the sledges. They heaved ropes in groups, chanting together to keep rhythm as they pulled massive blocks forward. The sound of their voices, the crack of the overseers' whips, and the groan of stone against wood would echo across the construction sites. The glory of Egypt's monuments was carved not only in stone, but in sweat and pain. Yet the role of slaves in Egypt was not limited to physical labor. Some were trained in specialized skills. A slave might become a scribe's assistant, learning to copy texts or keep records. Others could be trained as craftsmen, carving statues, making pottery, or working with metal. These skills did not bring freedom, but they could sometimes improve a slave's daily life. A skilled craftsman might be valued more, highly treated with a touch more care, and even earn small rewards like extra food or better sleeping quarters. Still, their fate remained tied to their status as property. They were never truly safe from being sold or punished. The presence of slaves also shaped the lives of free Egyptians. Ordinary farmers, artisans, and workers often lived only a step above slavery themselves. They might rent land from wealthy nobles, pay crushing taxes, and perform corvée labor, which was forced work demanded by the state. The difference was that free Egyptians had some legal rights. They could own land, marry freely, and pass property to their children. Slaves had none of these protections. The contrast between freedom and slavery was a constant reminder of how fragile life could be. One failed harvest, one debt unpaid, and a free farmer could see himself or his children fall into bondage. Socially, slaves were considered the lowest class. They had no voice in government, no presence in the courts, except as property, and no chance of rising on their own. Masters could reward loyalty with better treatment, but status itself was nearly impossible to change. The stories of slaves earning freedom exist, but they are rare enough to feel more like legend than reality. In this way, slavery in Egypt was both ordinary and crushing. Ordinary because it was everywhere a part of daily life, and crushing because, for the people trapped inside it, there was almost no escape. But even in this rigid structure, there were cracks. Human emotion does not follow rules. Masters sometimes grew attached to certain slaves, household slaves who cared for children or tended. The sick could form bonds that blurred the line between servant and family. There are records of masters freeing slaves in their wills, granting them land or property after death. Such moments were rare, but they show that even in a system built on control, the possibility of kindness existed. The tragedy, of course, is that kindness was never guaranteed. It depended entirely on the will of the master, and never on the rights of the slave. Looking at this wider picture, we see how deeply slavery was tied into Egypt's greatness. The shining temples, the overflowing granaries, the monuments that defy time itself, all relied on a system that drained the lives of the powerless. Slaves were not just laborers, they were symbols of conquest. They were offerings to the gods of empire. They were reminders of the sharp divide between the powerful and the powerless. Every day of their lives reinforced the message that Egypt's glory was built on their backs. And so when we imagine the daily lives of Egyptian slaves, we must widen our lens. Their days were not just about tending fields or grinding grain. They were threads in a vast tapestry of conquest, religion, economy, and society. They were at once everywhere and nowhere, vital and invisible. Their lives mattered enormously to the functioning of Egypt, yet their names were lost and their voices silenced. All that remains is the faint shadow of their presence woven into the stones, fields and stories of a civilization that still fascinates youths today. To understand the lives of Egyptian slaves, we must look beyond the work fields, temples, and households, and explore the emotional and psychological weight that slavery placed on them. Because while the body was forced to endure endless labor, this mind and spirit carried their own burdens. Life as a slave in Egypt was not just about physical suffering. It was about living every day without control, without certainty, and without the simple dignity that freedom provides. The greatest burden of slavery was the loss of identity. A free Egyptian could belong to a village, a trade, or a family line. They could point to their land or their ancestors and know their place in the world. A slave, on the other hand, was reduced to property. Their name could be erased, their family ties broken, their future uncertain. Some were even given new names by their masters, stripping away the connection to their past. Imagine being taken from your home, your language and your traditions, and forced into a life where even your name was no longer yours. That sense of dislocation never left many slaves. It lived with them in every task they performed, and every order they obeyed. Family life was one of the cruelest challenges for slaves. While some were allowed to live with spouses or children, many were separated at the will of their owners. A man could be sent to the fields, while his wife was forced to work in a household miles away. Children could be sold or given to temples to serve in religious duties. Family ties meant little against the demands of labor and ownership. Yet despite this constant threat of separation, slaves clung fiercely to whatever bonds they could form. A shared meal, a whispered story before sleep, a carved toy passed from parent to child. These small acts of love and connection gave strength even when the larger system sought to tear them apart. Fear was another constant companion. Slaves lived under the watchful eyes of overseers and masters. Punishment was never far away. A missed task, a broken tool, or even a moment of hesitation could result in a beating. The knowledge that violence could fall on you at any moment shaped how slaves moved, spoke, and even thought. Many learned to stay silent, never drawing attention to themselves. Others developed a sharp awareness of their master's moods, anticipating anger before it came. This constant vigilance drained the spirit, forcing people to shape their entire existence around survival, and yet resilience was part of the slave experience too. Humans have a remarkable ability to find meaning even in suffering, and Egyptian slaves were no different. They found comfort in religion and community, and in moments of imagination. The Egyptian belief in the afterlife provided a source of hope. Slaves could imagine a world beyond death, where their suffering would be weighed and found worthy of peace. In the field of reeds, they could rest in fertile lands free from hunger and toil. They could be reunited with lost family and walk once more as free people under the sun. The promise of this afterlife was more than just belief. It was a lifeline that helped many endure the endless days. Storytelling also played an important role after long hours of work. Slaves would share tales from their homelands or retell Egyptian myths around small fires. These stories connected them to their past and gave children a sense of belonging. Tales of gods who battled chaos or heroes who overcame hardship offered echoes of their own struggles. Through these stories, slaves could see themselves not only as victims, but as part of a larger narrative of endurance and strength. Music and rhythm also carried slaves through their days. In the fields, workers often sang in unison. Their chants kept time as they pulled ropes or carried loads, but they also offered a sense of unity. A song could transform labor into something more bearable, turning pain into rhythm and rhythm into survival. Even in the harshest conditions, music reminded them that they were human beings with voices that could not be fully silenced. For some, the greatest hope was the possibility of freedom. Though rare, it was not entirely impossible. A slave might earn their master's trust, serve loyally for years, or display a valuable skill, and eventually be granted manumission. Freedom could also come as a reward for bravery in battle, or through being purchased and released by someone sympathetic. These cases were uncommon, but the mere idea that freedom was possible kept the dream alive. Slaves passed on stories of those who gained release to remind themselves that chains were not always permanent. Still, for the vast majority, freedom never came, and so survival depended on resilience. Some slaves resisted in quiet ways, slowing their work, hiding food, or feigning illness. Others found subtle ways to assert their humanity by maintaining traditions from their homelands, or carving small charms to carry with them. Each act of defiance, however small, was a reminder that while their bodies were owned, their spirit remained their own. The psychological toll of slavery left deep marks. A life of constant labor and fear meant that many slaves lived with exhaustion not just in their muscles, but in their hearts. And yet, when we study their world, we find not only suffering, but remarkable endurance. They created families in impossible circumstances. They built communities out of shared struggle. They carried faith, songs and stories that gave meaning to lives others tried to erase. In the end, the story of Egyptian slaves is not only about oppression, but about survival. The monuments of Egypt may be made of stone, but the endurance of those who built them was made of something stronger. The daily lives of slaves show us how human beings, even when stripped of freedom, find ways to endure, to hope, and to live. Each sunrise over the Nile brought another day of hardship, but it also brought another chance to resist despair and to keep moving forward. By now we have seen how Egyptian slaves worked, ate, and endured, but to truly understand their world, we need to step into the broader culture that surrounded them. The Egypt of the pharaohs was a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and display, and slaves were woven into all of these elements. They were more than just laborers. They were part of how Egypt expressed power, wealth, and even its connection to the divine. Presence of slaves was most visible during large state projects. Temples, palaces, and monuments were not simply buildings. They were statements of authority. Every new statue or temple was a way for a pharaoh to declare his greatness to his people and to the gods. Slaves were a vital part of making these statements real. They carried stones, hauled timber, and mixed mud bricks for construction. Their work was not seen as individual effort, but as evidence of the pharaoh's control over both people and resources. The sight of hundreds of thousands of slaves laboring in unison under the sun was itself a demonstration of power. Ceremonies and festivals also revealed the hidden role of slaves. Egypt was a land of rituals and processions that honored the gods. Slaves prepared offerings, cooked feasts, cleaned sacred spaces, and sometimes even carried sacred objects during festivals. When priests paraded statues of the gods through city streets in grand processions, it was slaves who had worked behind the scenes to prepare every detail. They were the invisible machinery that allowed the spectacle to shine. Religion was one of the pillars of Egyptian identity, and without the hands of slaves, those rituals would have been far more difficult to sustain. Wealth of Egyptian elites was also displayed through their ownership of slaves. For nobles and high officials, the number and variety of slaves in their households was a visible mark of status. A wealthy man might own field workers, herdsmen, household attendants, and even entertainers. Slaves could be singers, musicians, or dancers, trained to provide amusement during feasts. In this way, slavery was not only an economic tool, but also a form of social display when guests attended banquets. They did not only see fine food and lavish decoration, they also saw the quiet line of slaves serving wine, grinding flour, and tending fires. Their presence reminded everyone of the wealth and authority of the host. For slaves themselves, this cultural role could sometimes offer unexpected opportunities. Talented musician or skilled artisan might find a position in a wealthy household where their abilities were valued more than their raw labor. While still bound by slavery, these individuals might enjoy better living conditions or closer contact with their masters. In rare cases, such proximity could even lead to trust or manumission. Stories exist of slaves who became confidants to powerful figures or who were granted freedom. After years of loyal service, these exceptions did not erase the suffering of the majority, but they remind us that even within the rigid system of Egyptian slavery, there were occasional openings. Another important cultural dimension of slavery was the connection between Egypt and the foreign world. Many slaves came from lands beyond the Nile Valley, captured in wars or raids. They brought with them their languages, traditions, and sometimes even their appearance in the form of distinctive hairstyles, clothing, or jewelry. In this way, slavery made Egypt more diverse. Though these people were stripped of freedom, they still influenced Egyptian culture. Nubian slaves, for example, introduced musical rhythms and styles of dance that found their way into Egyptian life. Asiatic slaves contributed skills in animal husbandry and craftsmanship. Slavery thus became a channel through which Egypt absorbed elements from the wider world. But even as slaves contributed to Egypt's cultural richness, they were constantly reminded of their outsider status. Egyptian art often depicted slaves as smaller figures behind their masters, shown carrying burdens or kneeling in submission. Tomb paintings of noblemen sometimes included images of slaves grinding grain or serving food, as if to declare that even in the afterlife, the nobleman would retain control over them. In this way, art reinforced the social hierarchy, making it clear who held power and who did not. The very walls of tombs and temples carried messages that slavery was part of the natural order. This cultural acceptance of slavery also shaped how free Egyptians viewed their own lives. For a poor farmer, the sight of slaves might be both reassuring and frightening. Reassuring because slaves performed the hardest labor, and frightening because the line between freedom and slavery was so thin, a bad harvest or a heavy debt could push a free man into bondage, and so slaves serve as living reminders of what could happen if fortune turned against you. This tension reinforced loyalty to the system. People clung tightly to whatever freedom they had because they could see the alternative standing beside them in chains. 4. The state slavery was not only a matter of labor, but also of symbolism. Pharaohs often described themselves as shepherds of their people, guiding Egypt with wisdom and strength. Yet at the same time, they boasted of the vast numbers of captives taken in battle and enslaved. This contradiction reveals how central slavery was to Egypt's identity. It was both a tool of empire and a measure of triumph. When foreign rulers sent tribute to Egypt, they sometimes included slaves as part of their gifts, reinforcing the image that Egypt's greatness was measured not just in gold or grain, but in the bodies it controlled. Yet despite this grand cultural framework, the daily lives of slaves remained grounded in exhaustion and survival. While the elites saw slaves as symbols of wealth or piety, the slaves themselves experienced only the endless cycle of labor, hunger, and fear. The glittering temples and golden tombs might celebrate gods and kings, but behind those treasures lay the invisible lives of countless people who never saw their names inscribed in stone. So, in the cultural world of Egypt, slavery was everywhere, and nowhere it was celebrated in art, reinforced in rituals, displayed at feasts, and written into the language of power. Yet the voices of the slaves themselves were never recorded. Their songs, their prayers, and their quiet acts of endurance vanished into the sands. What remains is the echo of their labor woven into every brick, every fairing, and every field they touched. Their cultural role reminds us that the story of Egypt is not just the story of kings and gods, but also of the forgotten hands that built their glory. As we come to the final part of our journey into the lives of Egyptian slaves, it is important to step back and see their story as part of the greater picture of history. Ancient Egypt is remembered today for its monuments, its art, and its astonishing achievements. Yet all of this splendor rested on the backs of those who had no choice, those who labored in silence and left little trace of their names or their stories. To understand Egypt fully, we must honor the lives of these forgotten people. Slavery in Egypt was not identical to the slavery practiced in other ancient worlds. It took different forms and shifted over time. Some slaves were war captives, others were debtors. Still others were born into bondage. Some served in fields or quarries, while others worked in households or temples. Despite these variations, the reality remained the same. They lacked freedom. They were denied control over their lives, and they lived at the mercy of others. Egypt's greatness depended on their suffering, even if its records rarely acknowledged them. What makes the story of Egyptian slaves so powerful is the mixture of suffering and endurance that defined their days. They lived with hunger, heat, exhaustion, and the constant threat of punishment. Yet they also laughed, sang, prayed, and dreamed. They held on to family when they could and rebuilt community when it was taken from them. They found strength in religion and songs and in small acts of defiance. Their resilience is as much a part of Egypt's legacy as the pyramids themselves. We often look at monuments like Karnak, Luxor, or the pyramids of Giza and marvel at their scale and endurance. But if we look closer, we can imagine the hands that cut the stone, the shoulders that bore the weight, the feet that trudged through the sand day after day. Each stone is a reminder that human lives were spent and often broken to create something that would outlast them. The glory of Egypt cannot be separated from the suffering of its slaves. Were not remembered in hieroglyphs or honored in tombs, but their effort is etched invisibly into every monument. Slavery also forces us to rethink the idea of civilization itself. We celebrate Egypt as a cradle of culture, science, and religion, and rightly so, but behind every shining civilization are shadows, lives spent in hardship, lives silenced by systems of power. The slaves of Egypt remind us that history is not only the story of kings, priests, and generals, it is also the story of farmers, builders, cooks, and children who had no voice yet carried the weight of empires. One of the most haunting truths is how little we know of the personal lives of these slaves. Their names were rarely recorded, their words almost never preserved. Archaeology gives us fragments, tools, huts, bits of food, remains of work sites, but not their voices. We can reconstruct their labor, but not their laughter. We can trace their punishment, but not their private dreams. This silence is perhaps the greatest injustice. They lived and died as part of a system that erased their individuality, leaving us to imagine what they must have felt. Yet, in imagining, we restore a kind of dignity. When we acknowledge their role in Egypt's story, we give them space in history. They were not simply shadows behind the greatness of pharaohs. They were people who endured hunger and heat, who whispered stories to their children, who prayed for freedom, who held each other close in the darkness of mud brick huts. They were not faceless, they were human. In remembering them, we also recognize patterns that echo across history. Slavery in Egypt may have ended long ago, but the exploitation of the powerless is a story told again and again in different forms across the centuries. The lives of Egyptian slaves remind us to look more carefully at the cost of greatness and to ask whose hands built the empires we admire. When we see the shining stones of the pyramids, we must also see the sweat that soaked into them. When we think of the glory of ancient temples, we must also think of the broken backs that made them possible. For the slaves themselves, life was about survival, one day to the next. The rising sun meant another round of labor. The setting sun meant another night of exhaustion and fear. But it also meant another chance to endure, another chance to sing a song, share a story, whisper a prayer, or carve a small token of hope into the world. These small acts of survival are the true monuments of their existence. Not made of stone, but of resilience carved into the spirits. When we think of Egypt, we should not only imagine pharaohs and pyramids, we should also imagine the countless men, women, and children who made it possible. Their lives were not recorded in hieroglyphs or celebrated in tombs, but they were just as real. Their days were filled with hardship, but also with endurance. And though history forgot their names, their story still matters, for without them the Egypt we admire would never have existed. This is the hidden heartbeat of Egypt's greatness, not the gold of its tombs or the stone of its monuments, but the lives of its slaves. Their story is not one of glory, but of survival. And by remembering them, we give voice to the silence they were forced to live in. The monuments still stand, the Nile still flows, and the memory of those who built Egypt endures even if history tried to erase it.